12 hours. That is how long it took 3,000 men from the frozen north to erase a city from the strategic map of the Mediterranean world in the summer of 859. Not 12 days of siege warfare, not 12 weeks of starvation tactics that broke defender morale, but 12 brutal hours from the moment Viking boots hit African sand until the moment their ships pushed back into the waves, carrying so much gold and so many captives that some vessels rode dangerously low in the water. By dawn, watchtowers spotted impossible ships approaching the Moroccan coast. By noon, the gates of Nekor lay shattered in splinters. By sunset, the emir himself sat bound in a longship hold, his palace stripped bare, his treasury emptied, and his city learning the hardest lesson that history teaches. Distance means nothing when your enemy rewrites the rules of geography itself. This is the story of how two Viking commanders led 62 warships across 2,000 miles of hostile water into a sea that did not belong to them, past naval patrols that should have intercepted them, and straight into the heart of an Islamic emirate that had made one fatal assumption. They assumed that because Vikings had never appeared in the southern Mediterranean before, Vikings could never appear there at all. That assumption cost them everything in less time than it takes for the sun to cross from horizon to horizon. But before we talk about the 12 hours that changed Mediterranean warfare forever, you need to understand what made this raid not just successful, but psychologically devastating in ways that military victories alone could never achieve. In the middle of the 9th century, the Mediterranean Sea belonged to the Islamic world in ways that seemed permanent and unquestionable, and ordained by God himself, according to the scholars who wrote about it. From the Straits of Gibraltar, where Africa nearly touches Europe, to the coasts of Syria, where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen from the islands of Sicily and Crete, to the ports of North Africa, where trade routes connected 3 continents, Muslim fleets dominated the waters with a confidence built on centuries of naval superiority that had never been seriously challenged. The Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from Cordoba, controlled the western Mediterranean with an iron grip. The Abbasids held the eastern waters with equal authority. Between them stretched a network of emirats and dynasties and trading powers that maintained order across a sea that had become, for all practical purposes, an Islamic lake where Christian ships sailed only with permission or at great risk. European Christians still held scattered coastal territories like fragile islands in a hostile ocean, fortified ports that required constant vigilance, and island strongholds that consumed enormous resources to defend. But their naval power had declined so dramatically since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire that most historians considered Mediterranean naval warfare to be a Muslim specialty that Christians could no longer seriously contest. Byzantine fleets occasionally challenged Muslim dominance in the eastern Mediterranean with expensive campaigns that achieved temporary victories, yet even Constantinople, with all its imperial resources, had learned to negotiate carefully with powers that could blockade its trade routes or raid its coasts with devastating efficiency whenever diplomacy failed. For the average merchant sailor or coastal dweller living in 859, the idea that a non-Muslim force could project serious naval power into the heart of the Mediterranean seemed not just unlikely or improbable, but genuinely absurd. It would be like suggesting that desert nomads might suddenly develop a navy capable of raiding London. The geography simply did not allow for such impossibilities to become real. It was into this world of assumed security and unchallenged dominance that the Emirate of Nekor had been built over generations of careful construction. Nekor sat on the northern coast of Morocco, where the Rif Mountains met the sea in green valleys that produced abundant crops. Nestled in a location that offered natural protection from land-based threats, while providing easy access to Mediterranean trade routes. It was not a massive imperial capital like Baghdad or Constantinople, not a center of world-shaking political power that commanded the attention of distant kings, but it was genuinely prosperous in ways that mattered to its inhabitants. The emirate controlled fertile agricultural land that produced grain and olives and fruits valued throughout the region. It managed trade routes connecting the interior of Africa to Mediterranean ports, where goods from sub-Saharan kingdoms could be exchanged for European and Asian products. And it served as a hub for merchants who moved textiles and spices and slaves and all the other commodities that made Mediterranean commerce profitable. Its markets sold everything that a medieval city needed to thrive economically. Its harbors welcomed ships from all Andalus and Africa and ports, even further east, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where different cultures mingled peacefully under Islamic rule. The ruling family traced its lineage back through the centuries to Idris ibn Salih, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, through his grandson Hassan, which gave Nekor not just political legitimacy that other dynasties might challenge, but religious prestige that commanded respect throughout the Muslim world. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca would stop in Nekor to seek blessings from this family of prophetic descent. Scholars came to study in its mosques, where learned men debated theology and law. The emir maintained correspondence with other Islamic rulers across North Africa, and Iberia paid tribute, when necessary, to more powerful neighbors, and navigated the complex web of alliances that defined Mediterranean politics with the skill that comes from generations of diplomatic experience. What Nekor conspicuously did not have was a serious navy worth mentioning in military dispatches. The Emirates' military strength focused almost entirely on land-based threats that came from directions its commanders understood intimately. Berber tribes from the mountains occasionally challenged its authority with raids that required military responses. Rival dynasties competed for influence in the surrounding territories with conflicts that sometimes turned violent. Bandits attacked caravans on trade routes, forcing the emir to maintain armed escorts for merchants. These were the dangers that shaped Nekor's defenses year after year, the threats that determined where soldiers were stationed, how walls were built, with what materials, and what kind of warfare its commanders trained for since childhood. The city had impressive fortifications designed by engineers who understood siege warfare walls, built to resist the kinds of weapons that land armies could bring against stone defenses. What it did not have were defenses designed to stop amphibious landings by seaborne raiders who could appear without warning from directions that made no strategic sense and disappear just as quickly after causing maximum damage. This was not carelessness on the part of Nekor's leadership, nor was it stupidity or incompetence of the kind that historians love to identify with the clarity of hindsight. It was pure, cold logic based on centuries of experience that said certain things simply did not happen in this part of the world. No northern power had ever launched a sustained naval campaign into the southern Mediterranean, where Islamic fleets patrolled regularly. The distance from Scandinavia to Morocco was too vast to cross without supply bases along the route. The logistics of moving hundreds of warriors thousands of miles through hostile waters seemed impossible to anyone who understood medieval naval capabilities. The risks were so overwhelming that attempting such a voyage would be military suicide that no rational commander would order. Viking raids had become a plague across the Atlantic coasts of Europe Yes, absolutely everyone knew this, and took it seriously. But those were different waters, entirely different enemies, fighting different kinds of wars, different strategic calculations that did not apply to Mediterranean realities. Northmen attacked monasteries along the coasts of Ireland and England, where wealthy religious communities had foolishly built near beaches without adequate defenses. They sailed up rivers deep into Francia, sacking towns that had grown complacent and extracting tribute from kings who found paying Vikings cheaper than fighting them repeatedly. They harassed the Christian kingdoms of Iberia, testing defenses and seeking whatever plunder they could grab before local forces could respond in strength. But they did not cross into the Mediterranean proper, and there were excellent reasons why this pattern had held for generations. The Straits of Gibraltar formed a natural barrier that any naval strategist could see on a map, a narrow passage just 8 miles wide at its tightest point, where strong currents ran between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, where winds could shift unpredictably in ways that destroyed ships, and where Muslim fleets from Cordoba patrolled regularly, specifically to prevent unauthorized passage. Any Viking force attempting to enter the Mediterranean would have to navigate those straits under the watchful eyes of the most powerful Islamic navy in the western waters, risk immediate interception by forces that knew these waters intimately, and then somehow operate thousands of miles from home, in hostile seas, surrounded by powers that could mobilize overwhelming force against them within days once their presence became known. It made no strategic sense whatsoever. It defied every reasonable assessment of risk versus reward that military commanders used to make decisions. So when the first disturbing rumors reached Nekor in the spring of 859, they were dismissed almost immediately by officials who had more pressing concerns. Coastal villages to the west sent reports of sightings that described strange ships that did not match known designs. Not the familiar lateen rigged vessels of Muslim traders that everyone recognized instantly, not the heavy cargo ships that moved goods along established routes on predictable schedules, but long narrow craft with distinctive square sails and rows of oars that witnesses claimed moved with unusual speed. The descriptions that filtered back to Nekor's officials were frustratingly vague and contradictory, the kind of reports that sounded more like confused fishermen misidentifying familiar vessels from unusual angles than genuine intelligence about an organized threat. Some witnesses claimed the ships carried 30 men, which would make them small raiding vessels. Others insisted they saw 100 warriors per ship, which seemed like obvious exaggeration. Some described dragon heads carved into the prows in northern styles. Others mentioned painted shields hung along the sides. The details did not add up to a coherent picture, and without concrete evidence of an actual threat, without any indication that these sightings represented an organized hostile force, rather than merchants or smugglers using unconventional designs, there was simply no reason to mobilize soldiers, disrupt the profitable trade that kept the emirate wealthy, or create panic among the population over what was most likely a misunderstanding born of poor observation and worse communication. Then the reports from the coast began to change in ways that made dismissal more difficult for even the most skeptical officials. A fishing village near the Straits of Gibraltar sent an urgent message describing several dozen longships moving east along the coast in organized formation. Not random merchant vessels sailing independently to different destinations, not raiders attacking targets of opportunity, but warships moving with clear purpose and military discipline, as if they knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they arrived. The village headman who sent the warning described the ships in enough technical detail that Neckor's military advisors could no longer dismiss them as misidentified trading vessels or exaggerated fishing boats. These were purpose-built warships carrying significant numbers of warriors, and they were penetrating deeper into the Mediterranean with every passing day. By the time Neckor's leadership began taking the threat seriously enough to convene emergency councils, the window for effective defensive response had already closed like a door slamming shut. Sending messengers to Cordoba, requesting naval assistance, would consume days just for the message to arrive, assuming the messengers did not get delayed or lost. Mobilizing Neckor's own small fleet of trading vessels and converting them into improvised warships would take even longer and produce vessels that could not match purpose-built warships in combat. Coordinating a defensive response with neighboring powers would require diplomatic negotiations that could stretch into weeks as different rulers argued about who should provide what resources and who would command any joint force. And all of that assumed the mysterious ships were actually heading toward Nekkor, rather than toward any of the dozens of other coastal targets they could potentially strike, first making any preparations specific to Nekkor's defense, possibly wasted effort defending against an attack that might never come. The Emir of Nekkor made what seemed like a calculated and reasonable decision given the information available and the time constraints involved. He ordered the garrison at the coast, reinforced with a modest number of additional troops, pulled from interior posts, enough soldiers to repel a typical pirate raid of the kind that occasionally tested coastal defenses, but not so many that it would leave the capital vulnerable to other threats from land-based enemies who might exploit any weakness. He sent messages to regional allies asking for any information they might have about the mysterious fleet, hoping to piece together a clearer picture of what he was facing. He instructed watchtowers along the coast to maintain constant vigilance and report any further sightings immediately through the established signal system. Then waited with the patience of a ruler who had learned through decades of experience that most threats never materialized into actual attacks because Nekkor, like every other Mediterranean power in 859, operated under assumptions that had held true for so many generations that questioning them seemed almost insulting to one's ancestors. Distance meant safety from northern barbarians who could not cross such vast stretches of hostile water. Naval dominance meant control over who could and could not operate in these seas. And Northmen, no matter how fearsome their reputation in the cold Atlantic waters where they terrorized Christian kingdoms, simply did not belong in the warm southern Mediterranean, where Islamic fleets had ruled unchallenged for centuries. Those assumptions about the fundamental nature of Mediterranean security were about to shatter with the sound of splintering wood and the thunder of thousands of boots hitting North African sand. The Vikings, who appeared off Nekkor's coast in the summer of 859, had not arrived by accident, divine intervention, or blind luck that somehow guided them across impossible distances. They had come through careful planning that spanned months, extraordinary seamanship that represented generations of accumulated knowledge, and a willingness to take risks that other naval powers considered suicidal, but which Vikings had learned through experience could pay off spectacularly. The expedition had begun its planning stages far to the north along the Atlantic coast of Francia, where Viking raiders had operated so successfully that the region's wealth was becoming depleted. Two commanders led the fleet and the strategic planning behind it. Hastein, a veteran raider whose name already carried weight across multiple Frankish kingdoms, a man whose previous campaigns had earned him both wealth and reputation as someone who understood how to turn violence into profit. and Bjorn Ironside, a warrior whose lineage connected him to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, carrying a name that opened doors and recruited followers, because Viking warriors valued bloodlines that proved themselves through successful raiding. Together, they had assembled 62 longships and recruited thousands of men for a campaign that promised wealth beyond anything the increasingly well-defended coasts of northern Europe could offer anymore. By 859, the Viking world faced a strategic problem that threatened the entire raiding economy their culture depended upon. For decades, Norse raiders had extracted enormous wealth from monasteries and towns and kingdoms across Britain and Ireland and Francia, wealth that flowed back to Scandinavia and funded the construction of more ships and the recruitment of more warriors in a cycle of expansion that seemed limitless. But success had brought diminishing returns that could not be ignored by anyone paying attention to profit margins. Coastal settlements that had been easy targets in earlier generations had learned from bitter experience to build serious defenses. Armies had adapted their tactics specifically to counter Viking raids, developing rapid response forces that could reach attacked locations before raiders could escape with their plunder. Kings had organized systematic defensive networks that made raiding increasingly expensive in terms of Viking casualties required to achieve the same level of profit. The element of surprise that had made early Viking raids so devastatingly profitable had eroded through simple repetition until surprise became impossible. Wealthy targets still existed throughout northern Europe, absolutely, but they were increasingly fortified behind stone walls, increasingly prepared with trained defenders, and increasingly expensive to attack successfully when you factored in the casualties that even successful raids now produced. The North Sea and the Atlantic coasts had become saturated with competing Viking fleets, different crews and different commanders, all chasing the same limited supply of plunder in regions that had adapted their defenses specifically to counter Norse tactics. Some Viking leaders responded to this strategic problem by pushing further into river systems, sailing deep into Francia to strike inland targets that had not yet learned to defend against waterborne attack. Others turned away from raiding entirely toward permanent settlement, claiming land through conquest and transforming from raiders into rulers who governed territories rather than simply looting them. Hastein and Bjorn Ironside chose a radically different path that would reshape Viking strategic thinking for generations. They would go where no Viking fleet had gone before, into waters that had never seen Norse warships, against targets that had no experience defending against the specific kind of warfare that Vikings had perfected. The Mediterranean represented everything the northern raiding grounds were not in ways that made it strategically attractive to commanders willing to take extraordinary risks. Warmth, instead of cold, that could kill you if you fell overboard in winter. Wealth concentrated in undefended coastal cities rather than scattered across heavily fortified monasteries that now required actual sieges to capture. Trade routes absolutely thick, with merchant vessels carrying silk and spices and gold and slaves, goods that commanded premium prices in northern markets. And perhaps most importantly, from a tactical perspective, shores that had never seen a Viking longship coasts, where the mere appearance of Norse warriors would create the kind of psychological shock and confusion that had made early raids in Britain so profitable before defenders learned what they were facing. The expedition's first massive challenge was simply reaching the Mediterranean at all, without being destroyed in the attempt. The Straits of Gibraltar had a fearsome reputation among sailors of all nations, a reputation built on countless ships that had attempted passage and failed, with deadly results. Currents moved with brutal force, that could sweep vessels onto rocks before crews could react. Winds shifted unpredictably in the narrow passage, creating conditions that could go from favorable to deadly within minutes. Submerged rocks lurked beneath the surface near both shores, invisible until they tore through ship hulls. And most dangerously for this expedition, Muslim fleets from Cordoba patrolled the waters regularly with specific orders to watch for any unauthorized vessels, particularly Christian raiders or pirates who might threaten the trade routes that made Cordoba wealthy. For a fleet of 62 longships, each carrying 40 to 50 warriors, plus supplies and equipment, the straits represented a choke point where detection would mean the entire expedition could be intercepted and destroyed before achieving a single objective. Hastein understood this vulnerability better than anyone, which is why he spent weeks gathering intelligence before attempting passage. Rather than charging directly toward Gibraltar, hoping for luck, the Viking fleet first struck targets along the Iberian Atlantic coast in carefully planned raids designed to test Muslim defenses and gather information about naval patrol patterns. They raided small ports where they could capture fishing vessels whose crews knew these waters intimately. They interrogated sailors who understood the currents and the tides, and most importantly, the schedules of Cordoba's warships patrolling the strait. What they learned through these preparatory raids was information that made the impossible crossing possible through careful timing. Muslim naval power, while genuinely dominant, was not omnipresent in the way defensive planners assume. Patrol routes followed predictable patterns based on established schedules. Gaps existed in coverage during certain times and certain conditions. The Vikings studied these patterns with the patience of hunters stalking dangerous prey, waiting for exactly the right moment when multiple factors aligned in their favor. Under cover of darkness and favorable winds that would carry them through quickly, the fleet began passing through the straits in groups during the late summer of 859. Not all 62 ships at once in a massive convoy that would be impossible to miss, but in smaller groups of 5 or 10 vessels, spread across several nights, reducing the chance of detection by patrol vessels. By the time coastal watchers in Cordoba realized that a major northern fleet had successfully penetrated into the Mediterranean, the longships were already dispersed along the African coast, moving east toward targets whose names the Vikings had learned from interrogating captured merchants traded in these waters. The crossing itself demonstrated something that Mediterranean powers, with their heavy warships, had not fully appreciated about Norse seamanship and ship design. Viking longships were not clumsy northern vessels, designed only for river raids and coastal attacks against poorly defended monasteries. They were sophisticated ocean-going craft, built by cultures that had successfully navigated the North Atlantic, reached Iceland through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, and explored seas far more treacherous than the Mediterranean with its relatively calm conditions and predictable weather pattern. The shallow draft of longships allowed them to beach on almost any coastline, meaning Vikings did not need ports or harbors to land their forces. Their speed under oars or sail gave them tactical mobility that heavier Muslim warships simply could not match when it came to rapid strikes and escape. And their crews possessed navigational knowledge accumulated over generations of long-distance voyaging that enabled them to find their way across open water using techniques Mediterranean sailors had never needed to master because they could navigate by coastal landmarks. Once inside the Mediterranean, the Viking fleet operated with the kind of calculated aggression that had made Norse raiders the terror of Atlantic Europe for generations. They struck the Balearic Islands First in the western Mediterranean, hitting multiple targets to test how quickly Muslim forces could respond to raids in this region and learning valuable lessons about how coastal defenses were organized and what kind of resistance they should expect. These initial attacks served multiple purposes beyond simple plunder. They gathered gold and supplies that would sustain the expedition for months of operations, far from any Viking bases. They refined tactics for Mediterranean conditions, where beaches were different, and settlements were fortified differently than in northern Europe. And most importantly, they created massive confusion about the fleet's true intentions and ultimate destination, because Muslim authorities trying to track dozens of longships that could move independently had no way of predicting where the raiders would strike next. Muslim authorities across the western Mediterranean issued warnings to coastal cities describing the northern raiders and their distinctive ships. Naval patrols intensified in areas where Vikings had been sighted, with commanders receiving orders to engage any longships on sight. But the Mediterranean was vast beyond any one power's ability to patrol completely, and tracking 62 longships that could move independently beach on remote shores to avoid detection and avoid major shipping lanes, when necessary proved nearly impossible with the communication and coordination systems available in 859. Meanwhile, Nekhor remained largely unaware of the developing threat, despite the warning signs. The Emirates' intelligence network focused primarily on threats it understood rival dynasties competing for territory, Berber tribal movements in the mountains, caravan security protecting trade routes. Information from the sea came slowly filtered through merchant reports that arrived weeks after events, and occasional messages from other ports that might or might not be accurate, depending on who sent them and what they had actually seen. By the time reliable word reached Nekhor that Viking ships had definitely entered the Mediterranean and had already raided the Balearic Islands hundreds of miles to the north, weeks had passed since those attacks occurred. By the time the emir's advisors gathered to debate whether this posed a direct threat to their own city or whether the raiders would target other locations, the longships were already moving south along the African coast. Hastein had chosen his ultimate target with the careful calculation of a merchant evaluating investment. Nekhor offered several strategic advantages that made it ideal for the kind of raid he was planning. It was wealthy enough that capturing it would make the entire expedition profitable, even if no other raids succeeded. But it was not so heavily defended that it would require a prolonged siege that could trap the Vikings between the city and relief forces. Its location on the Moroccan coast placed it outside the immediate response range of major Muslim naval powers in Cordoba and elsewhere. The city's defenses were clearly oriented toward land-based threats rather than amphibious assault from the sea. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of the expedition's larger strategic goals, successfully sacking an Islamic emirate on the North African coast would send a message that would echo across the entire Mediterranean world and establish Vikings as a force that could strike anywhere. The psychological impact of proving that distance meant nothing would be worth more than any amount of gold they could carry away. As the fleet approached the Moroccan coast, after weeks of raiding and scouting, Nekhor's watchtowers finally spotted what guards had been told to watch for, but had not really believed would appear. Dozens of ships with striped sails and shields hung along their sides, moving with the disciplined coordination of an organized military force rather than random pirates. The formations were tight, the ships maintained perfect spacing, the whole fleet moving with a purposefulness that indicated these were warriors who knew exactly what they were doing and where they were going. Messengers rode hard toward the capital, carrying news that defied every strategic assumption that Nekhor's leadership had built their defenses around. North men, Vikings. Here, off the shores of an African emirate, thousands of miles from their homeland, where they had no business being according to every map and every historical precedent. The emir convened his council with the frantic energy of men who had just realized that all their careful defensive planning had been based on completely wrong assumptions about what threats were possible. They debated options with mounting desperation. Should they attempt to negotiate with these raiders offering tribute to make them leave without attacking? Should they mobilize the entire garrison to the coast and abandon the interior defenses? Should they send urgent messengers requesting immediate help from Cordoba and neighboring emirates? Even though everyone knew that help could not possibly arrive in time, the debate consumed precious hours, while Viking oarsmen consumed the distance to shore with steady rhythmic strokes. By dawn, on the day that would define Neckor's place in history, Hasten's fleet was beaching on the sand, not tentatively or cautiously, but with the confident aggression of raiders who had crossed an ocean, navigated through hostile waters, sailed past every defensive barrier that was supposed to keep them out, and now intended to take what they had come for. The longships hit the beach in coordinated waves that demonstrated years of practice at exactly this kind of assault. The first vessels grounded with their prows driving up onto sand, and warriors poured over the sides before the ships had even fully stopped moving, forming defensive shield walls with practiced efficiency, even as their boots sank into unfamiliar African sand. The sound of it carried across the water and up the slopes toward the city, a sound that inhabitants of this region had never heard before in their lives. The rhythmic thunder of oars being shipped all at once across dozens of vessels. The harsh, scraping sound of keels grinding against sand and stone. The shouted orders of commanders organizing their forces in a language that Neckor's defenders had never heard spoken by an enemy, a language that sounded harsh and guttural and completely alien to Arabic speakers who dominated this coast. Neckor's coastal garrison numbered perhaps 300 men who had been stationed there to watch for pirates or small raiding parties, not to fight off an army. They formed defensive lines across the beach, approaches, and called for reinforcements from the city, attempting to hold positions that should have been defendable against normal raiders. But nothing about this attack resembled the threats they had trained for or the tactics they understood from experience. The numbers were catastrophically wrong. The tactics were completely unfamiliar. Everything about this assault contradicted their training in ways that made coherent response nearly impossible. 3,000 Viking warriors came ashore like a tide that could not be stopped by a few hundred defenders, no matter how brave. The first wave established a beachhead with interlocking shield walls that provided cover for subsequent waves landing behind them. Archers moved into position and began providing covering fire that kept Neckor's defenders at distance. Units formed up in tight formations and began advancing up the slopes toward the city with the methodical discipline of professional soldiers, executing a plan they had rehearsed. And behind them, still visible on the horizon, more ships waited, more warriors, ready to reinforce the assault, more proof that distance had stopped meaning anything, that safety was an illusion, and that the Mediterranean's assumed order was about to be rewritten in sand and blood. The assault on Neckor began with a kind of methodical violence that separated organized Viking armies from opportunistic raiders who relied on luck. 3,000 warriors hit the beach in coordinated waves, each group knowing exactly what their role was in the larger plan. The first groups formed interlocking shield walls immediately upon landing, creating defensive positions that protected subsequent landings from any counterattack. Archers wearing lighter armor moved into position behind these shield walls, providing covering fire that forced Nekor's defenders to keep their heads down. Squad commanders shouted orders in Old Norse, organizing their forces with the smooth efficiency of men who had executed this exact maneuver dozens of times before across dozens of different coastlines throughout their raiding career. Nekor's garrison met them on the slopes, leading up from the harbor a few hundred defenders against thousands of attackers, in a battle where the mathematics alone made the outcome inevitable before a single weapon was swung. But what shattered Nekor's resistance was not just the overwhelming numbers that crushed them through sheer weight. It was the completely alien nature of the threat they faced. The city's soldiers had trained their entire lives to fight Berber cavalry that attacked from predictable directions, using tactics everyone understood. They had prepared to defend against siege engines that would approach the walls methodically. They had drilled to hold fortifications against armies that would surround the city and attempt to starve them out over weeks. They had absolutely never faced shield walls that moved like single organisms with every warrior perfectly synchronized, never encountered the particular savage ferocity of Norse warriors who fought with axes specifically designed to shatter shields and drag down defenders. Never experienced the psychological weight of facing an enemy whose language and appearance and fighting style belonged to an entirely different world that had somehow manifested on their doorstep. The Vikings advanced up the slope in formations so tight that defenders could not break them apart. Arrows from Nekor's walls struck shields and occasionally found gaps in the formations, but not enough to slow the relentless advance even slightly. When some of Nekor's defenders attempted to countercharge down the slope, hoping to use momentum and their knowledge of the terrain to disrupt the attackers, they crashed into shield walls that absorbed the impact and then pushed back with overwhelming force that sent defenders stumbling backward. The first defensive line protecting the approach to the city broke completely within an hour of the initial landing. Survivors fell back toward the city's outer walls in disorder, hoping desperately that stone fortifications would provide the defensive advantage that open ground had denied them so catastrophically. The Emir's commanders sent messengers racing through the streets with orders to mobilize every man capable of holding a weapon. Merchants abandoned their shops and grabbed whatever arms they owned. Craftsmen left their workshops and reported to their assigned defensive positions on the walls. Even religious scholars who normally avoided violence entirely took up positions with weapons they barely knew how to use, understanding with terrible clarity that this was not a raid that could be bought off with tribute or negotiated away through diplomacy. The Vikings reached the gates before Nekor could fully organize its interior defenses or complete the mobilization. What happened next demonstrated exactly why Norse raiders had become the absolute terror of coastal Europe. The attackers did not settle in for a traditional siege that might last weeks. They did not attempt starvation tactics or disease warfare. They did not even pause to rest after their assault up the slopes. Instead, they brought forward specialized tools they had carried on their ships specifically for breaching gates tools that proved they had planned this attack down to the smallest detail. Heavy axes with specially reinforced heads designed for destroying wood rather than killing men. Sledgehammers that could cave in iron reinforcements, and a small battering ram that required only a dozen strong men to operate effectively, but could focus tremendous force on a single point. The gates of Nekor had been built by skilled engineers to resist the kind of siege equipment that Berber armies might bring overland on wagons, massive, heavy wooden beams, reinforced throughout with iron bands set into stone walls that rose 2 stories high on either side. These were genuinely impressive defenses that had never been breached by any land-based army that had tested them. But Viking axes were not traditional siege weapons designed for methodical destruction over days. They were specialized tools built by a culture that needed to breach obstacles quickly so that raids could maintain their momentum and shock value. Teams of warriors attacked the gates in rotation to prevent exhaustion.
One group would strike with furious intensity for several minutes, axes rising and falling like machinery, then fall back exhausted, while a completely fresh team took their position without any break in the assault. The sound of it echoed through every street in the city, the relentless thunder of metal striking wood in rhythm, the splintering of timber as the gates began to fail, the shouted coordination of men who understood that speed was as important as strength in this kind of warfare. Defenders on the walls above poured down everything they had. Arrows fell in thick volleys that wounded some Vikings and killed a few. Stones were dropped through murder holes, designed for exactly this purpose. Some defenders tried pouring heated oil through gaps, though they had not prepared enough, and ran out quickly. Vikings fell with arrows in their throats or crushed skulls from dropped stone. But the assault never paused, never slowed, never gave defenders time to regroup or organize more effective countermeasures. The gates that had protected Nekor for generations began to show cracks, then visible gaps, then finally gave way entirely in a cascade of shattered timber and torn iron bands. Vikings poured through the breach like water through a breaking dam, and the street fighting that followed turned Nekor's interior into a nightmare of close quarters. The city's narrow lanes, which should have favored defenders who knew every alley and courtyard, instead became killing grounds where Vikings' small unit tactics proved devastatingly effective against defenders fighting on their home ground. Norse warriors operated in tight groups of 10 to 20 men, each unit moving with coordinated discipline through unfamiliar streets, using their shields to create mobile walls that protected them from attacks from windows and rooftops, while their axes and swords cleared resistance with brutal efficiency. Nekor's defenders fought with desperate courage, building by building, trying to slow the advance through sheer determination to protect their homes and families. Some barricaded themselves in mosques and houses, forcing Vikings to clear each structure individually in fighting that became personal and vicious. Others attempted ambushes from rooftops and side streets, where they had advantages of position and surprise. A few units even managed organized counterattacks that briefly pushed invaders back in local victories that raised hope. But none of it mattered strategically, because Vikings were not trying to hold territory block by block. They were not attempting to govern the city or win over its population. They were there to take everything valuable and leave, which meant they could afford to be absolutely ruthless in ways that defenders trying to protect their homes simply could not match. By midday, with the sun beating down mercilessly, Viking forces had fought their way to the palace in the city's center. The emir's personal guard made their final stand on the palace steps, knowing that this was where history would judge their courage. These were professional soldiers, unlike the militia and merchants who had fought elsewhere, men who had protected the ruling family for years and understood that surrender meant shame and probable execution. They formed a tight, defensive line across the entrance, spears and swords ready, absolutely determined to sell their lives
as expensively as possible to protect their lord. Hastein himself led the assault on the palace because he understood the symbolic importance of capturing the emir personally, the value it would add to the raid's profitability through ransom, and the message it would send across the Mediterranean. The fighting on the palace steps was hand-to-hand combat that was vicious and brief, and decided by numbers rather than courage. When the heavy doors finally gave way after the defenders were overwhelmed, Hastings' warriors swept through the interior, hunting for the ultimate prize. They found the emir in his private chambers, surrounded by family members and advisors, who had nowhere left to retreat, no escape route that had not been cut off. There was no dramatic last stand, no defiant speech recorded for posterity, just the cold reality of a ruler who had run out of options, confronting warriors who held absolute power over his fate.
The Vikings did not kill him because dead rulers cannot pay ransoms, and ransom was always more profitable than revenge. With the palace secured, and the emir now a valuable captive, organized resistance throughout Nekor collapsed like a structure that had lost its foundation. Scattered pockets of defenders continued fighting in various neighborhoods, some out of loyalty to their captured ruler, others out of sheer desperation because they had nowhere to run and no hope of mercy.
But the battle for control of the city was effectively over before sunset decided in less than 12 hours from the moment the first Viking boots hit the beach. What followed was not combat, but systematic extraction of wealth, conducted with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Vikings moved through the city, targeting locations where valuable items concentrated with the precision of merchants conducting inventory.
The palace treasury was emptied first. Every gold coin and silver piece and jeweled item carried out in sacks. Then the markets, where merchants kept reserves of trade goods and coins for conducting business. Then the mosques, where religious endowments and donations had accumulated over decades of piety. Then the homes of wealthy families who had not managed to flee or hide their valuables effectively in the chaos. Captives were selected with equally cold calculation based on their value.
The emir and his immediate family represented the most valuable prizes because their ransoms would be enormous. But Vikings also took wealthy merchants, who could be exchanged for substantial gold-skilled craftsmen, whose expertise might be valuable in Scandinavian markets, and young healthy people who could be sold as slaves in the thriving slave markets that existed throughout the Viking world. They were not indiscriminate kidnappers grabbing everyone they saw, because every captive represented food that would be consumed during the voyage home, and space occupied on ships where room was limited. The loading process consumed hours as warriors formed human chains from various locations in the city down to the beach where ships waited. Bundles of plunder passed hand to hand, gold and silver and valuable textiles and weapons, and everything portable that could be sold for profit back in Scandinavia or in the markets of Europe. Other Vikings maintained security throughout the evacuation, patrolling the streets to prevent any organized counterattack and ensuring no Nekor force could threaten the withdrawal operation. By late afternoon, when shadows were lengthening, Hastein gave the order that ended Nekor's nightmare. The Vikings began their withdrawal in organized stages, maintaining tight defensive formations as they pulled back toward the beach. The rear guard kept their shields locked and weapons ready until the very last warriors reached the sand and waded out to waiting ships. Then, with the same coordinated discipline they had shown during landing. Oars slid smoothly into position, sails rose to catch favorable winds, and the fleet that had appeared impossibly on Nekor's horizon began pulling away from shore. Their holds were packed with more treasure than most of these warriors had seen in their entire lives. Their decks were crowded with captives, who would bring additional wealth through ransom or sale. Their reputation now expanded permanently to include an achievement that no Muslim power had thought possible in their worst strategic nightmares. They had crossed the Mediterranean through waters that should have been impossible to navigate. They had sacked an Islamic emirate on African soil that should have been protected by distance and naval superiority. And they had done it all with casualties so minimal that barely registered against their total force, proving that audacity and seamanship could overcome any defensive assumption. Behind them, Nekor burned in scattered locations where fighting had spread fires that no one had time to contain. Survivors emerged slowly from hiding places throughout the city, moving through streets that were littered with the debris of shattered defenses and broken assumptions. Some searched desperately for family members. Others simply stared at destruction, trying to process what had happened in less than one day. The city's walls still stood mostly intact. Most buildings remained structurally sound. The population had not been systematically slaughtered as might have happened in other kinds of warfare. In purely physical terms, Nekor would eventually recover from this raid and rebuild what had been taken. But something else had been destroyed that morning that would take far longer to rebuild than any wall or market, and that was the fundamental assumption of safety, the belief that geography provided real protection, the confidence that Islamic naval dominance made the Mediterranean southern shores untouchable by northern barbarians who supposedly belonged in different waters entirely. As the sun set on that summer day in 859, the longships disappeared over the horizon, carrying with them not just gold and captives, but proof that the world had fundamentally changed. That distance meant absolutely nothing when enemies possessed the ships and the will to cross any obstacle. That reputation and tradition and historical precedent meant nothing when facing warriors who refused to accept that certain things were impossible. That no coast anywhere, no matter how far from Viking homelands or how well protected by naval powers, could ever again consider itself completely beyond the reach of Norse raiders who had just proven they could strike anywhere. If you found this story of how 12 hours changed Mediterranean warfare forever fascinating, make sure you subscribe, because next week we are revealing how a single Viking ship with just 40 warriors terrorized over 100 miles of Spanish coastline in a campaign so brazen that Muslim chroniclers still argue about whether it actually happened or was exaggerated beyond recognition. And the navigation techniques Vikings used to cross 2,000 miles of open water without compasses or maps will absolutely blow your mind when you understand the brilliance behind methods that seemed like magic to their enemies, but were actually sophisticated science. Only now, beginning to fully appreciate and replicate